814th contact. Tuesday, July 26, 2022, 011 HRS. Billy. Here we are again, so I can give you the metal analysis of the metal I received from Semjace at that time, which was analyzed very precisely in the USA by Dr. Vogel. After all, his real analysis was totally different from the one done by EMP in Zurich or in St. Gallen, which was strangely evaluated as terrestrial or void. This is known to me, but all that was given as an analysis was only an infamous lie, because as we could fathom through our clarifications of that time, the whole thing was based on a swindle, because the metal samples were not analyzed for their materials, because it was said beforehand that they were only allegedly pieces of metal of extraterrestrial origin, consequently everything was immediately ridiculed. With this, the die was already cast with regard to the alleged analysis, which was then actually fraudulently made, and without such actually having taken place. At that time, our very precise clarification clearly showed that it could also not be analytically established that the metal sample was not an earthly product. This was the reason why we ordered that a real analysis should be made elsewhere, whereby our committee, through my daughter Semjace, instructed you to pass on some of the metal samples and to have them analyzed in America by real experts. So, through Lee Elders, Wendell Stevens and Tom Welch, the samples came to the USA and to Dr. Marcel Vogel, who then worked very precisely and did an analysis, which was not completely finished when we had to intervene for security reasons, but the essentials were already revealed by the analysis. However, when he then wanted to do further analysis that would have revealed metallurgical findings that would still have been revealed almost 200 years too early on Earth, we had to intervene and take away the piece of metal sample that you had provided to him. Billy. You just made it disappear on him, I was told. You can call it that, yes. Billy. Good, then here is the analysis translated into German, which I guess Wendell Stevens, Lee Elders and Tom Welch had translated, which we also have in our small papers, which are in English and German, as you may not know. No, I really do not know that. Billy. All the better, then you can read the whole thing here. Additional metal analysis. By Wendell C. Stevens/Lee Elders/Tom Welch, USA. A small sample of one of the four metal states, examined by EMP in Zurich and also by Dr. Walter W. Walker, was brought to Dr. Marcel Vogel for microanalysis. Dr. Vogel is a research chemist at IBM's investigative laboratories in San Jose, California, and a pioneer in luminescence technology. He developed liquid crystals, magnetic films, the floppy disk, etc. He is a pioneer in communication between human beings and plants and in energy transmission research and also wrote books and articles about it. He began his work with the only tiny piece of metal of the second state form, the lackluster silver piece, which had been obtained from the Pleiadians, note Billy, Plagiarin. He discovered a great deal that had not been found out before, in the broad field of metallurgical analysis. First of all, he found that one side of the microspecimen examined with a magnification factor of 500 stood up to the evidence that it had been machined in its microstructure, very probably with a laser. Examining the piece with the X-ray diffraction technique for elemental analysis, he found a single elemental deposit of thulium, Tm, atomic number 69, atomic weight 168.934, a rare transition element in the lanthanide series, and also rhenium, Re, atomic number 75, atomic weight 186.2, another rare metal. Thulium is usually only found in a transition state in modern Earth technology. He also found traces of bromine and argon gases alloyed in the metal. One side of the thulium indicated micromachining. In a spectroanalysis, thulium showed the remarkable property that there was only one region of the main peak band for this element, and no secondary bands. All the elements studied with spectroanalysis have missing bands in their spectra that should be present if the elements had a normal atomic spectrum. This shows that the elements are composed very unusually compared to normal Earth technology. The spectrograms are completely different from what you would call an isotope. The spectrograms showed very high elemental purity and no secondary bands or catalyst. Most of the elements studied had the same non-terrestrial characteristics. Because there was no ash and no heat residue, it essentially indicated a non-electrical cold melt process of synthesis. Such a process is currently unknown in Earth technology. A similar degree of purity was also recorded for an elemental aluminium as well as for silver. Another unique feature of these elements was the almost perfect uniform fall of lighter elements, preceding those studied by the spectrometer. Here the main band was at a very high purity level and then, without secondary bands and catalyst, an absolutely uniform curve of lighter elements, gases included, preceding the elements in question. It seems as if the desired metal is the result of a uniform buildup of atomic density particle by particle. The analysis of a non-metallic part of the sample with polarized light, called birefringence in a measuring method, showed crystalline structures that were organized in a spiral shape. The hexahedral shape of the crystals was clearly visualized under the electron microscope with a magnification factor of 2000. A micrographic photo showed unusual clarity, indicating unusual conductivity of the electrons illuminating the image. If one were normally dealing with ordinary, non-conductive crystals such as quartz, the electrons would accumulate at the crystal tips, creating a space charge that would obscure the images. The conductivity was so effective that the lower crystal structures within the crystal could be made visible, something previously unknown. The electrical bonding between the main crystal elements was so effective that a clear view through the crystal lattice structure was achieved. It revealed a spiral structure with regular intervals in the composition of the subparticles. Gas bubbles, occlusion, were not present. If this had been produced by a heat fusion process, the picture would have been quite different and a greater mixture of elements would have been expected. There are exceptionally pure metals in one part of the specimen and non-metallic, extremely conductive crystals in another part. The composition of the crystals results in a non-identifiable substance that was previously unknown. Another micropart of the sample consisted of pure silver, again with no secondary bands and no contact substance. The silver was unusually conductive, it was fluid, smooth, frictionless, and connected to an aluminium surface that was also unusually conductive. Potassium, chlorine and bromine with a high degree of purity were also found. A density measurement showed other real anomalies in density and variable density curves indicative of the density gradient. The metal specimen, wrapped in a small plastic envelope, was carried by Dr. Vogel himself when he transported it, accompanied by Dr. Richard F. Haynes, to the Ames Research Laboratory. The aim was to conduct even more unusual investigations. Suddenly, the metal sample disappeared, leaving no trace or damage in the envelope. Dropping or mistakenly misplacing the sample while packing it in the envelope is out of the question. The original shape of the metal specimen was even still pressed into the plastic material of the envelope. This would have been even more disturbing if we had not already had to deal with a similar disappearance in Switzerland, where the metal sample had the next earlier condition of the sample mentioned above. The following unique features that came to light during the investigations of the metal sample make it exotic and point very clearly to a non-terrestrial origin. 1. Unusual degree of purity of the metal, analyzed spectrographically. 2. Absence of contact substance or secondary spectrogram lines. 3. Unusual number of trace elements found from the heaviest to the lightest gaseous elements, all along the scale, without interruption or gap. Again, all these lines show the same high purity for each element. The scientists mentioned have never seen anything like this before. 4. Strange, very uniform grain formation with a layer of horizontal grains sandwiched between layers of vertical grains, which are themselves sandwiched between two layers of horizontal grains, etc., in a tight lattice construction. 5. A metal surface showed an extremely fine machine cut, possibly made by means of a laser. 6. Composition of non-metallic crystals showing a strange structure and an extremely high conductivity for the elements. 7. The continuous buildup of lattice formations in the crystal structure and the spiral composition or piling up of crystals in the non-metallic substance was unique. 8. Some kind of non-electrolytic cold synthesis process is clearly identified. 9. There is evidence that the synthesis took place in a vacuum. This metal specimen certainly did not come from anything known, and especially not from a smelting process of the terrestrial kind or from the residue of a scrap metal container. The real origin of these small metal fragments could very well be what the witness claims, namely extraterrestrial origin and extraterrestrial processing. We can offer no other explanation at this time. The investigation continues. Very interesting, I really do not know that in this form, I mean in the German language. What I read, that was in English, but in German it is better to understand for me. Billy. Me too, because I have always found English a disaster of a language that I never liked to speak and, moreover, have long since forgotten much of it. It is just fine for emergencies. Wendell also told me, which Lee and Tom also confirmed, that Dr. Vogel explained that the approach would be made in 150 years at the earliest and that it would then certainly take another 50 to even 100 years of research to produce the metal so that it would be equal in this respect. That may be very good, for if I let present-day earthly metal research pass through my senses, then Dr. Vogel was right, for the present state of earthly metallurgical knowledge is still so primitive that it is more than truly ridiculous what is being dreamed of and experimentally aimed at with regard to the Earth orbiting station in Earth orbit in relation to possible space travel. There is nothing to object to if successes are achieved in the station with regard to research results that are useful for the health of Earth humans and for general progress, but I cannot judge the dreaming with regard to space travel as good and correct, for it is so illusory that it really amuses me. What will be possible in the future will result from Earth humans in SOL space in such a manner that, for example, Mars and other planets, as well as their moons, can be explored and also exploited, but this does not correspond to the possibility of being able to carry out space travel, for the real space only begins far outside the SOL space system. Concerning foreign languages, however, you also spoke ancient Greek and modern Greek, as well as some Arabic, French and Italian, but also Turkish and Hindi, as I know. We spoke Greek with each other at the beginning of our contacts, and you cannot speak any of that anymore? How is it with Billy? I have forgotten all that. I learned it very quickly in 3 or 4 weeks, but I also forgot it again very quickly. I must say that I could not speak any language perfectly, but it was always enough to make myself understood and also to understand what was said to me. The last time I spoke Perdani, for example, it still worked when we, Guido and I, made an effort at the garage place and tried to use the radio to create a means of communication whereby the core group members could have made contact with your committee. It was at that time when there was also talk of this and plans already existed for a screened room in which someone from you could also have been present, of course also screened but visible, to hold conversations with core group members. But all that eventually went down the drain because betrayal was practiced at that time and that was then the end of the whole thing, and not least because, which almost cost me my life. I am aware of that because my daughter Semjace told me everything personally. It was she, after all, who put you, Jacobus and Elsie in your condition. Billy. We do not have to talk about that. It was simply the end of the whole thing, which was planned and could have been. This also made the whole thing with that part of the foreigners, the ones from, unnecessary, that a contact should be attempted with them who have been circling around in the earthly skies since time immemorial, but who have never been able to detect your presence, and indeed still not up to today, although your ancestors came to Earth some 25 million years ago and you can still come here unrecognized from them and do your work. It is quite something that you Plagiaran have been able to move and stay away from the foreigners in such an unrecognized manner for 25 million years, by which I mean those foreigners who, according to your explanations, came from. The other foreigners, we can leave them out, because we will continue to exercise all necessary caution, as against some as against others, also against Earth humans, because there is still, unfortunately, the possibility of. Billy. Excuse me, but you do not have to say it, for it is also clear what would be, for you would be hunted down on one side as well as the other. Both the Earthlings are keen on your technology, which also includes the second group of foreigners, as well as the foreigners from, who could optimize their highly developed technology in such a special manner that they could locate things that are still unlocatable even for them, get hold of you, copy your technology, and then unexpectedly penetrate into your dimension. As it is now, however, their aeroblitzers remain UFOs, which, however, certain Americans. This, however, is of course disputed, denied and kept secret, just like, of course, the military, secret service and governmental machinations, which would be so monstrous for the ordinary citizen that, if he or she knew, they would pull out all their hair or kill themselves. About which, however, nothing shall be said. Billy. Of course not, because I will put everything in full stops as usual. Yes, it has to be. Billy. Of course. Only those megalomaniac Earthlings did not understand that, who ran the SETI project, which they should never have started, and also those who advocate it today do not understand that it should never have been designed and realized. To worry about that now, and to make adverbs about it, is far too late, because this nonsense should have been considered earlier. Billy. That is, unfortunately, the case, yes. As unfortunately as what the Swiss government is up to, that it will not let it end with the fact that it has already demolished Switzerland's neutrality by adopting the sanctions of the EU dictatorship and applying them against Russia, but now wants to destroy neutrality completely and utterly, under the destructive cover of a cooperative neutrality. The latter is to be able to hold maneuvers at home and abroad without directly joining the murderous organization NATO. What happens later, however, that sooner or later entry into this murderous organization becomes inevitable, is not thought about for the time being, but only when it is too late and the people then roar and rage and exclaim, if we had known, then. But then it will be too late and many dead Swiss women and Swiss children will be sowing through the country. It will then be what has been said since time immemorial, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, and this because Swiss neutrality will have gone completely to hell, forced upon us by irresponsible rulers who are supposed to guarantee security for the country and the people. In my opinion, these are no longer righteous rulers who are at the helm of the country today, but false and unworthy rabble who have no right whatsoever to sit in government and only cause mischief which, moreover, will be carried into the future and bring evil. This is also what we have been pursuing and bringing to the notice of our peoples of late, who are commenting that if this is done, then neutrality, which is always to uphold and protect unbending and conceivably neutral forms in any case and under any circumstances, completely loses its value. If, therefore, the opposite is done in any form to the neutrality of a state, then this is tantamount to a betrayal of neutrality and, as it were, a betrayal of the country. So this was the case with the already very negatively tarnished neutrality of Switzerland, which has already irresponsibly and criminally broken the neutrality of the state by adopting the EU sanctions and applying them against Russia and somehow made it fair game for possible attackers. And this is done by completely irresponsible rulers who are absolutely unfit for their office, but are nevertheless hoisted into positions by just such irresponsible people, where they can then exercise their incompetence unchallenged and plunge the state and its population into misfortune. This is particularly incomprehensible from the very negative machinations of the Swiss state leadership, since our entire planetary people, we report to our peoples of the entire Federation what is important on Earth at any given time, not only political, but also natural events, etc., have always had high regard for the leaders of Switzerland, ever since we reported on this freedom state. Now, however, this mood has turned negative, because a general lack of understanding has spread, which also raises the question why the people allow such misleading state officials at all and do not remove them from office immediately and without pardon. Billy. Unfortunately, this is not possible according to our existing and primitive laws in this regard, because those who squat at the helm of government are protected, and their rights are also bent so that nothing can be done to them. So they can do whatever they want, as evil, mendacious and bad as possible, but they will always be proved right. If, however, they do not like someone in their own ranks, then the person is simply disregarded, cut, and pushed away until he or she throws in the towel of his or her own accord or is simply thrown out or voted away. This is what happened, for example, with Federal Councillor Blocher, who was simply voted out of office because he really represented the freedom of Switzerland and the people, which did not suit certain parties and people. On the other hand, misguided federal civil servants and other state officials are exalted, as happened with a federal councillor who was granted all the rights of protection, although he, and thus did wrong, so he can continue to act as a federal councillor. What else is happening now is that the part of the crazy and totally irresponsible rulers in Bern want to make a complete pig out of neutrality, precisely by Switzerland wanting to join forces with the murder club NATO in maneuvers, under the want of falsehood cooperative neutrality. Ta. A word invention by state leaders who are irresponsible and stupid non-thinkers who do not care that by turning what is planned into reality, a treason will be committed and the state and its people will be exposed to future and unpredictable dangers that. Billy. Who will not live to see the end of the song because everything will go down the drain before then? Ta. That's about the right way to put it, then. Billy. Yes, that's just what I was thinking. Ta. That it will be so, if the nonsensical of that kind can be enforced, then it will indeed be so. Billy. With this falsehood, the people are to be bamboozled and deceived by good-for-nothings and swindlers who also want to have Switzerland incorporated into the EU dictatorship and thus banish the freedom of the entire Swiss people into EU dictatorship slavery. What kind of sad figures are these, who are such stupid and crooked figures of government, who are incapable of taking any responsibility for the country and the people, whereby Switzerland and the entire people are walking into the open knife of ruin and downfall? From a neutral point of view, the very fact that Switzerland wants to join forces with the murder and criminal organization NATO as a maneuver partner, according to the sense of the traitors to the country, is not only criminal treason, but absolutely impossible, because true neutrality never allows such a request, let alone such an action. This is also not the case when irresponsible rulers traitorously juggle with words like cooperative neutrality and falsely and arbitrarily justify it in a deliberately fraudulent manner. But what this clique of murderers NATO, in addition to helping America's hegemonic mania, allows itself in its war mania obsession and thus in murderousness and destructiveness, whereby the countless rapes committed on the country's own girls, boys and women and these are later stabbed or shot, as this is committed in the Ukrainian army, but as it is common practice in every other army, but is deliberately hushed up, are not yet mentioned. That is not all. The truth is that everything goes even further, because this NATO clique of murderers manages to involve all the states of Earth in a conflict from which there is no way out that would lead to peace. I am not the only one who sees it that way, but also many others who even recognize the dangerousness of the murderous organization NATO and write about it in newspapers, etc., as the following article from yesterday proves. NATO, the most dangerous military alliance in the world. Uncut-news.ch, July 25, 2022. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who spent 15 years as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, where he headed the Middle East Bureau and the Balkans Bureau. Previously, he worked abroad for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor and NPR. He is the host of the Emmy Award-nominated RT America program On Contact. At no time, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, have we been closer to the precipice of nuclear war. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and its thoroughly dependent arms industry, with its billions in profits, have become the most aggressive and dangerous military alliance in the world. Founded in 1949 to thwart Soviet expansion in Eastern and Central Europe, it has become a global war machine in Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa and Asia. After the end of the Cold War, NATO expanded its presence and violated its promises to Moscow by admitting 14 countries in Eastern and Central Europe into the alliance. Soon it will also admit Finland and Sweden. It has bombed Bosnia, Serbia and Kosovo. It has instigated wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria and Libya that have cost nearly 1 million lives and driven some 38 million human beings from their homes. It is building a military presence in Africa and Asia. It has invited Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea, the so-called Asia-Pacific Four, to its recent summit in Madrid at the end of June. It has extended its reach into the Southern Hemisphere and signed a military training partnership agreement with Colombia in December 2021. It has supported Turkey, which has NATO's second-largest military and has illegally invaded and occupied parts of Syria and Iraq. Turkish-backed militias are involved in the ethnic cleansing of Syrian Kurds and other residents of northern and eastern Syria. The Turkish military is accused of war crimes in northern Iraq, including several airstrikes on a refugee camp and the use of chemical weapons. In return for President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's permission for Finland and Sweden to join the alliance, the two Nordic countries have agreed to expand their domestic terror laws, making it easier to crack down on Kurdish and other activists, lift their restrictions on arms sales to Turkey and deny support to the Kurdish-led movement for democratic autonomy in Syria. This is quite a record for a military alliance that became obsolete with the collapse of the Soviet Union and should have been disbanded. NATO and the militarists had no intention of embracing the peace dividend and promoting a world based on diplomacy, respect for spheres of influence and mutual cooperation. They were determined to stay in business. Their business is war. This meant extending its war machine far beyond the borders of Europe and engaging in an unrelenting state of war with China and Russia. NATO sees the future, as set out in its document NATO 2030, United for a New Era, as a struggle for dominance with rival states, especially China, and calls for the preparation of a protracted global conflict. China is pursuing an increasingly global strategic agenda underpinned by its economic and military strength, NATO's 2030 initiative says. It has demonstrated a willingness to use force against its neighbors, as well as economic coercion and intimidating diplomacy far beyond the Indo-Pacific region. Over the next decade, China is also likely to challenge NATO's ability to build collective resilience, protect critical infrastructure, engage with new and emerging technologies such as 5G, and protect sensitive sectors of the economy, including supply chains. In the longer term, it is increasingly likely that China will extend its military might around the world, possibly also to the Euro-Atlantic area. Moving away from the Cold War strategy. The alliance has abandoned the Cold War strategy that ensured Washington was closer to Moscow and Beijing than Moscow and Beijing were to each other. The hostility of the US and NATO has made Russia and China close allies. Russia, which is rich in natural resources such as energy, minerals and grain, and China, a manufacturing and technology giant, make a powerful combination. NATO no longer draws a distinction between the two, proclaiming in its recent policy statement that the deepening strategic partnership between Russia and China has led to mutually reinforcing attempts to undermine the rules-based international order that run counter to our values and interests. On the 6th of July, Christopher Wray, director of the FBI, and Ken McCallum, Director General of Britain's MI5, announced at a joint press conference in London that China was the greatest long-term threat to our economic and national security. They accused China, as well as Russia, of interfering in the US and UK elections. Wray warned the business leaders they spoke to that the Chinese government was out to steal your technology, whatever your industry is, and use it to undercut your business and dominate your market. This inflammatory rhetoric is a harbinger of an ominous future. You cannot talk about war without talking about markets. The political and social turmoil in the US and its dwindling economic power have led it to see NATO and its war machine as a means to its demise. Washington and its European allies are fearful of China's trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative to connect an economic bloc of some 70 countries outside U.S. control. The initiative includes the construction of railway lines, roads and gas pipelines to connect with Russia. Beijing is expected to invest $1.3 trillion in the BRI by 2027. China, which is on track to become the world's largest economy within a decade, has launched the Regional Integral Economic Partnership, the world's largest trade pact of 15 East Asian and Pacific countries representing 30% of world trade. China already accounts for 28.7% of global manufacturing output, almost twice as much as the US at 16.8%. China's growth rate was an impressive 8.1% last year, but is slowing to about 5% this year. By contrast, the U.S. growth rate was 5.7% in 2021, the highest since 1984, but will fall below 1% this year, according to forecasts by the New York Federal Reserve. if China, Russia, Iran, India and other countries break free from the tyranny of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency and the International Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT, a messaging network that financial institutions use to send and receive information such as money transfer instructions, it will trigger a dramatic fall in the value of the dollar and a financial meltdown in the US. The enormous military spending that has driven the US debt to $30 trillion, $6 trillion more than the entire US GDP, will become unsustainable. Servicing this debt costs $300 billion a year. The US spent more on the military in 2021, $801 billion, which corresponds to 38% of total global military spending, than the next 9 countries, including China and Russia, combined. The loss of the dollar as the world's reserve currency will force the US to cut spending, close many of its 800 military bases abroad and deal with the inevitable social and political upheavals triggered by economic collapse. It is a bitter irony that NATO has accelerated this possibility. In the eyes of NATO and American strategists, Russia is the starter. NATO hopes that its military will become entrenched and weakened in Ukraine. Sanctions and diplomatic isolation, the plan goes, will oust Vladimir Putin from might. A patronage regime will be installed in Moscow to do the bidding of the US. NATO has given Ukraine more than $8 billion in military aid, while the US has pledged nearly $54 billion in military and humanitarian aid to the country. China, however, is the main course. Unable to compete economically, the US and NATO have resorted to the blunt instrument of war to cripple their global competitor. Provocation of China. China's provocation is a repeat of NATO's agitation against Russia. NATO expansion and the US-backed coup in Kiev in 2014 prompted Russia first to occupy Crimea in eastern Ukraine, with its high proportion of Russian-born population, and then, in February, to invade all of Ukraine to thwart the country's efforts to join NATO. The same dance of death is being played out with China over Taiwan, which China considers part of its territory, and with NATO expansion in the Asia-Pacific. China flies fighter jets into Taiwan's air defense zone and the US sends naval vessels through the Taiwan Strait, which connects the South and East China Seas. In May, Foreign Minister Antony Blinken called China the greatest long-term challenge to the international order, referring to its claims to Taiwan and its aspirations to dominate the South China Sea. Taiwan's president recently posed in a Zelensky-like publicity stunt with a Pan-Zero missile launcher in a photo circulated by the government. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen holds a locally made missile launcher this morning. Source: https://t.co/li18nzjfnpic.twitter.com/ni6vtvcd, Rick Glowert, @RickGlowert, June 2, 2022. The conflict in Ukraine was a bonanza for the arms industry, which needed a new conflict after the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. Lockheed Martin's share prices are up 12%, Northrop Grumman is up 20%. The war is being used by NATO to increase its military presence in Eastern and Central Europe. The US is establishing a permanent military base in Poland. The 40,000-strong NATO response force is increased to 300,000 men. Billions of dollars worth of weapons are pumped into the region. However, the conflict with Russia is already backfiring. The ruble has risen to a 7-year high against the dollar. Europe is heading for recession due to rising oil and gas prices and fears that Russia could cut off supplies completely. The loss of Russian wheat, fertilizer, gas and oil due to Western sanctions is causing chaos in world markets and a humanitarian crisis in Africa and the Middle East. Rising food and energy prices, shortages and crippling inflation bring not only deprivation and hunger, but also social unrest and political instability. Climate emergency, the real existential threat, is ignored to appease the gods of war. Threat of nuclear war. The warmakers are frighteningly cavalier about the threat of nuclear war. Putin warned NATO countries to expect greater consequences than ever before in history should they intervene directly in Ukraine and ordered Russian nuclear forces to be put on heightened alert. The proximity of US nuclear weapons stationed in Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Turkey to Russia means that a nuclear conflict would wipe out much of Europe. According to the Federation of American Scientists, Russia and the United States control about 90% of the world's nuclear warheads and have about 4,000 warheads each in their military stockpiles. U.S. President Joe Biden warned that the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would be totally unacceptable and would have serious consequences, without saying what those consequences would be. This is what U.S. strategists call deliberate ambiguity. After the Middle East fiascos, the U.S. military has shifted its focus from fighting terrorism and asymmetric warfare to confronting China and Russia. President Barack Obama's national security team conducted a war game in 2016 in which Russia invaded a NATO country in the Baltics and used a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon against NATO forces. Obama officials were divided on how to respond. the so-called Principals Committee of the National Security Council, including cabinet members and members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, decided that the United States had no choice but to retaliate with nuclear weapons, writes Eric Schlosser in The Atlantic. Any other kind of response, the committee argued, would show a lack of resolve, damage American credibility, and weaken the NATO alliance. Choosing an appropriate nuclear target, however, proved difficult. An attack on the Russian invading force would kill innocent civilians in a NATO country. An attack on targets inside Russia could escalate the conflict to all-out nuclear war. Finally, the main committee of the National Security Council recommended a nuclear attack on Belarus, a country that had played no role in the NATO allies' invasion but had the misfortune of being a Russian ally. According to the New York Times, the Biden administration has formed a tiger team of national security officials to conduct war games on what to do if Russia uses a nuclear weapon. The threat of nuclear war is downplayed with discussions of tactical nuclear weapons, as if lesser nuclear explosions would somehow be more acceptable and not lead to the use of bigger bombs. At no time, not even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, were we closer to the precipice of nuclear war. A simulation developed by experts at Princeton University begins with Moscow firing a nuclear warning shot, NATO responds with a small strike, and the ensuing war claims more than 90 million casualties in the first few hours, reports the New York Times. The longer the war in Ukraine goes on, and the US and NATO seem determined to pour billions of dollars in weapons into the conflict over months, if not years, the more the unthinkable becomes conceivable. Flirting with Armageddon in order to generate profits for the arms industry and fulfill the futile quest to reassert US global hegemony is extremely reckless at best and genocidal at worst. Source: Chris Hedges, NATO, most dangerous military alliance on planet. Translation: LZ. Source: https://uncutnews.ch/die-nato-dos-gfalakesti-militerbuendaneas-der-walt. Ta. This article actually describes what is threatening. Apparently, there are still Earth humans who think deeply about the evil world situation and the circumstances that lead to it. That is indeed amazing how far-thinking the writing is. Billy. That is what I also was thinking, which is why I found I would put the article in front of you and you would see that apart from those pathetic lunatics of governments who cut down and make a pig of normal thinking people in their ranks, there are also otherwise self-thinking human beings who consider everything as it must be. So apart from those who do not think for themselves but let others think for them, there are other human beings in the government and among the people who think for themselves and do so a little further than is usual and do not simply listen to propagandist and partisan speeches. Thus, those who really think for themselves do not simply listen to the partisan speeches of the partisans who make a pig out of Russia and thus Putin, while on the other hand hailing Zelensky and America to the skies. These self-thinkers remain neutral and see equally the mistakes, the injustice and the wrong as well as the criminal, the destructive and inhumane things that are being done on both sides of the warring parties. So they condemn in a non-partisan and neutral manner the wrongs committed on both sides, consequently not taking sides with one side or the other. This alone is correct and also prevents the preferential supply of weapons to one party, which in turn makes things worse and worse. Moreover, this is a crime of unparalleled proportions, for every earthling who supplies weapons or supports them is guilty of the deaths of those human beings who are killed or murdered by these weapons. And in this culpability, it makes absolutely no difference who the suppliers and supporters of the weapons are, whether they are state leaders or people from the people. They are all guilty of the death and murder of human beings, regardless of whether they are warring soldiers or civilians, because killing human beings always remains murder, and any person who supplies weapons or even advocates the supply of weapons is guilty of such murder. Ta. This is correct, and every Earth human should bear this in mind and thus prevent the supply of weapons. In particular, this would be extremely necessary with regard to Ukraine and the fanatical and pathological warmonger Zelensky, who is in the service of the American state leadership and its dark leadership. Billy. That is clear, but there is no point in going on about it, because it is much worse today than it used to be with the Earthlings, because since the general stultification of the majority of them has taken hold, all preaching of logic, reason and rationality has gone to the wind, and consequently it fades away like sound and blows away like smoke. Let us therefore move on to something else, which is also talked to the wind, but which is becoming ever more precarious and will lead earthly humanity to ruin if the necessary countermeasures are not finally taken and implemented. In this regard, I am talking about overpopulation, through whose fault the entire world is already poisoned and there is not a single natural space left that is not affected by poison or filth, etc. Even the Arctic and Antarctic are affected by this, as are all seas, all lakes, streams and rivers, all bodies of water in general, all mountains up to the highest heights, the atmosphere, the whole of nature, its fauna and flora and all ecosystems in general. When human beings have exploited the earth of its resources, wiped out most of the animals, the fauna and all life forms and almost completely destroyed the plant world and poisoned all waters together with their creatures and made them unfit for life, and when they have allowed the human world population to overflow in such a manner, then it is recognized far too late by the non-thinking human beings that through their fault and their machinations everything has been destroyed and annihilated. That was worth living. Namely, through the destructive and devastating machinations of overpopulation. The sky above the earth has existed since time immemorial, for billions of years, and has practically always remained the same, but the earth itself, the beautiful planet, has changed adversely. But it has not done this by itself and on its own authority, but it happened through the evil, criminal, irresponsible, negative influence of the human beings, which happened as a result of all the machinations that were provoked and carried out by overpopulation, and still are. Not only the planet itself, but also all ecosystems, the entire life-form worlds of fauna and flora, as well as the atmosphere, the climate and all waters have been maltreated by the human beings in such a way that such a planetary change and destruction of life forms has resulted as nature could never produce. With toxins, fire, concrete, iron, asphalt and steel, etc., as well as with land constructions and all kinds of protected areas, deforestation, other forest clearings, as well as maliciously set forest fires, and through artificially created climate change, everything has been pushed beyond the edge of what nature and its entire ecology can bear. With the dangerous life-destroying pollution of all kinds of the environment and all waters, etc., unnatural conditions have been created that human beings are no longer able to bring under control. As a result, Earth humans are heading towards something that they will never, under any circumstances, be able to control. This is unfortunately a fact that can no longer be changed. But now, unfortunately, my time is up and I must leave soon. But I still have a few things to discuss with you that should not necessarily appear in the discussion report. I also still have something to say from Quetzal concerning the greenhouse, namely that you should be concerned that the original state is restored, that everything grows and flourishes again as it did before everything was improperly changed, and since then growth has fallen prey to harmful consequences. Billy. I did not make the change. Quetzal insists that the original state be restored so that everything grows and thrives again. Billy. It will be done, because that is what I am going to strive for. Good, I will pass that on. He is very concerned that everything works correctly, that is why he is at the center so often. Billy. But then I want to ask you why the youth, especially in Europe, are becoming so aggressive. Do you know anything about that? It is based on climate change, which changes human beings in various wises, not only in their not even half-baked thinking, which goes hand in hand with stultification and aggressiveness, but also in an organic change. Due to these factors, not only the youth, who are very susceptible to it, but also gradually the adults become more and more brutal and irresponsible thugs, and finally also evildoers of a different kind. But now I have the following to say, which you are then to retrieve separately. Billy. What is it about witchcraft that you wanted me to tell you about? I am afraid we will have to postpone that. Now I really must go. Goodbye, Edouard. Billy. Take care, Ta.